AP Statistics. In this video, we are beginning Unit 3, and Unit 3 kind of takes our focus off of analyzing data and how we deal with it mathematically, and now we're going to focus more on where the data comes from. So that's what Unit 3 is all about. So in your book, we're going to cover chapters 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3. So I know it's confusing because it's Unit 3, but Chapter 4, but you'll get over it. Okay, so in the first section, we're going to talk about sampling and surveys, and we're going to talk about how we sample and all of that kind of stuff. So in this video, we're going to talk about section 4.1. So that is going to roughly take us through the first couple of pages of notes. So as we look at this, first we're going to define some basic vocabulary. And we talked about what a population is already. Your population in a statistical study is your entire group of individuals we want information about. Now, don't get this confused with world population. So if we're talking about the population of Fort Worth, it's everybody who lives in Fort Worth. When we define population in statistics, we're talking about the group of individuals or items that we want to know more about. So that population, how we define that is very fluid based on who we're interested in studying. And remember, a census means the same thing it always means. Census collects data from every single individual in the whole population. Now, depending on how big the population is that you're interested in learning about, a census can be very, very daunting. It can be very time consuming, and it can be very costly. So a census is not always a great idea, depending again on how big your population is. So that leads us to collect what we call a sample. And this is just a subset of individuals in the population. And if we sample correctly from the population, hopefully it will represent the population well. So an example of this is, let's say we've got our population of interest here. Okay, so this is everyone we're interested in. So if we take a sample, we're just going to take a few of those people, well, depending on how many, okay? How many would be representative? It depends on what population size is and what your sample size is. But what we would do is just take a smaller subset of that population. And remember, we learned this in one of our other units, that when we're referring to mathematical values about the population, we refer to them as parameters, and samples would be statistics. So let's say I wanted to talk about the average GPA. Let's say my population is high school students, right? So if I wanted to talk about the average GPA, well, the average GPA for my population would be a population parameter, but the average GPA for my sample would be a sample statistic. So that's the difference between those two. All right, so a sample survey, what is that? It is just a study that collects data from a sample to learn about the population. Okay, so we want to learn about the population, and we don't want to have to talk to every single person in that population, so we take a sample. All right, so here's the deal with sampling. You can sample well, and you can sample poorly. If you sample poorly, it can lead to bias, and we don't want that. That is very bad. So there's a couple of different types of sampling that will lead to bias inevitably. And keep in mind that you can't rid yourself of all bias, but you can certainly eliminate a lot of it, and that is our goal. So anytime we sample because it's easy on us, okay, that is called convenience sampling. So you're selecting from the population who are easy to reach. An example of this might be if, let's say my population of interest, CHHS students, right? So almost 2,000 people. So let's say I want to take a sample from CHHS that's easy on me. So I want to look at GPA, let's say, and I decide to let my third period be my sample. Well, that's great and all because it's easy because I see third period every other day. But is third period AP statistics necessarily representative of my whole population? Probably not. So not a great idea. Something else to consider is that the design of your study shows bias if it is very likely to underestimate or very likely to overestimate some value that I want to know about, all right? And another type of sampling that often allows a lot of bias in is voluntary response sampling. Well, voluntary response sampling just means that people are allowed to choose whether or not they want to be in the sample. So in other words, a good example of this would be, let's say I said, hey, fourth period, I have this survey I want you to take. I'm going to put it on Canvas. You know what? If you want to answer it, great. If you don't, that's fine too. So often what you see with voluntary response sampling is that, let's say I sent out a survey about something controversial. If I send out a controversial type survey, guess who's going to respond? The people who feel very strongly about it in one direction or the other. So typically with voluntary response sampling, you don't really get an indication of a good sample that represents the population because you're just going to get people who feel strongly one way or the other. All right, so that's just some of the information about sampling and some of the things that can go wrong. I'm going to do another video and talk to you about good sampling because this video is already too long.